of June 1950, North Korean troops charged across the 38th parallel, invading South Korea. It was an action that would not only involve them, but many other nations from around the world before the war was finished. The lightning attack caught ROK and U.S. troops off guard. Outnumbered, the Allies were forced southward. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, fell to the enemy 3 days after the incursion. ROK and U.S. troops fought valiantly, but were ill-prepared to stop the offensive. By the 13th of July, North Korea occupied half of South Korea and were forcing the defenders south, fighting as they went. By this time, South Korea had lost more than half of its army, more than 50,000 soldiers. President Truman rushed additional forces to the Republic, but not until the Allies had retreated to Pusan was the North Korean offensive finally stopped. Here, Allied resolve stiffened, which allowed General Douglas MacArthur, commander of forces in Korea, to devise and implement a bold stroke by landing UN forces deep behind enemy lines at Incheon, about 30 miles west of Seoul. Then Second Lieutenant in the ROK Marines, Park Jung-mo, was one of those men involved in this desperate struggle.
North Korea invaded South Korea illegally after they had introduced all kinds of weapons, including tanks and planes, from the Soviet Union. At that time, we were poor in manpower and equipment, so Seoul was captured by them 3 days after they attacked. Seoul citizens were in disorder. We put the second defense line south of Suwon, but they pushed continuously with their tanks, so we had to retreat again. At last, we took up a position on the Nakdong River near Pusan. The Nakdong River was the last defensive line. There were desperate fights. The enemy resisted frantically, but our soldiers fought desperately, knowing that we had to recover the territory. We resisted with the faith in certain victory that we must not retreat, not even a step. At that time, I worked as a platoon leader in South Korea's Marines. I was assigned to the Incheon Landing Unit, consisting of the U.S. Marines 1st Division, 1 Korean Marine Regiment, the U.S. Army's 7th Division, and the ROK Army's 17th Regiment. At that time, 261 ships were anchored near Yeongjong Island, near Incheon, and fired fiercely on the Incheon coast. They were completely defeated by the tremendous bombardment from naval guns. As a result, we cut the waist of the enemy.
With their supply lines threatened, North Korean pressure on the Pusan perimeter began to cease, and the UN troops began the long road back. For AFKN News, I'm Navy Journalist Bob Holley. As the UN forces fought their way inland from their Incheon beachfront, troops from Pusan broke out and pushed the North Koreans back up the peninsula. The two forces linked up on the 26th of September, recapturing Seoul on the same day. ROK Marine 2nd Lieutenant Park Jung-mo raised the Korean flag over the city's hall.
After we landed in Incheon, we participated in recapturing Seoul. At that time, my unit was occupying Seoul Station. I reached the Capitol building and hoisted the Korean flag. My platoon soldiers who had fought together saluted the flags. Each soldier shed tears, and all the citizens who were under enemy domination shouted Daehan Minguk Manse, which is long life for Korea. Thinking about it now, it's an unforgettable time in my life.
By the end of September, the North Korean army was pushed back across the 38th parallel, which ended the fighting on South Korean territory. Then, on October 6, 1950, Allied forces crossed the 38th parallel to pursue the Communist forces. On the 19th of October, the UN soldiers found themselves in the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. After the fall of the North Korean capital, resistance from the Communists was light and scattered, and soon the UN forces reached the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. By this time, more than 135,000 North Korean prisoners were taken. Victory over the Communist forces seemed to be complete. The Allies were in control of the whole Korean peninsula by the end of October, but during the month of November, the war would take a sudden and drastic change for the Allies. For AFKN News, I'm Navy Journalist Bob Holley. With North Korea now occupied by UN troops and the North Korean army beaten and scattered, the scenario for the Korean conflict was about to undergo a sudden change. On the 25th of November 1950, Communist Chinese troops poured across the border into North Korea. They first encountered the ROK 2nd Corps, which they drove back, and 3 days later attacked the U.S. 10th Corps situated around the Chosan Reservoir. Once again the fighting was fierce. UN troops heavily outnumbered were forced to retreat south. This continued until once again the Chinese had crossed the 38th parallel, and Seoul once again fell into Communist hands on the 4th of January 1951. The city of Wonju soon followed suit on February 14th. It is at this time that the Chinese offensive lost its momentum. UN troops constantly fighting back, even as they were pushed southward, stopped, and then pushed the Chinese northward. Incheon was recaptured on 10 February 1951. Then Lieutenant Del Tate of the 4th Aerial Reconnaissance Squadron had these comments.
I belong to the 45th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron. We flew the old World War II Mustang, the P-51, that we called the F-51, that was fitted with a camera and machine guns and rockets. And our job was to go out and do reconnaissance in North Korea, looking for specific targets we'd been assigned. And then once we'd covered our specified areas, then we were free to hunt anything we could find. We hit trucks, tanks, communication lines. One evening we got a bunch of boats in a river. My part was to lead the strike, find the target, and take the fighter bombers in, mostly Marines and Navy. And then they'd carry the heavy ordnance, and after I'd mark the target, and I'd come back around and take pictures, and we'd do assessment. And then while the thing was going on, we'd suppress flak. A lot of people talk about the fun it would be to fight a MiG with an F-51, but for the people who are flying the 51, it's not fun, so we always run. The MiGs very seldom came down this far, although occasionally a MiG would sneak down and slip in. Most of the enemy air power that came down here was the little, we called Bed Check Charlie. It was a little airplane that they would load up with hand grenades and mortar shells and small bombs, and they would fly in about 2 o'clock in the morning, midnight to 3 o'clock in the morning, and fly down the flight line throwing out explosives trying to damage the aircraft. At that time, they had very little communication, so our job was to try to cut off ammunition and supplies they were bringing in. And so that's why we would do reconnaissance on the roads. We had a request for a reconnaissance on I've forgotten the name of the town in North Korea, but I did a photo run down that area where some rivers and roads came together, and in the picture they could count something like 70 heavy anti-aircraft guns, and they pointed them out to me that they were tracking, and you could see the shadows on the ground as they moved, and if they'd have fired, it'd have blown me out of the sky. You know, that's one of the things I always remember about.
Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway succeeded General MacArthur as Commander-in-Chief of UN forces on 11 April 1951 as the troops continued to push the Chinese north of the 38th parallel, achieving this by the end of May. For AFKN News, I'm Navy Journalist Bob Holley. After a Chinese offensive was stopped by a heroic stand at Chipyong-ni, the Allies once again pushed the Chinese northward. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, was recaptured on the 15th of March, 1951. UN forces continued their march to the 38th parallel, virtually unopposed until the end of May. Finally, on the 10th of July, 1951, General Ridgway, Commander-in-Chief, met with Chinese delegates for talks at Kaesong. But these talks broke down in August as the Battle of Bloody Ridge commenced. This battle, now called Heartbreak Ridge, ended on 14 October 1951 as negotiations reopened, this time at Panmunjom. The opposing armies settled down into a stalemate as Chinese offensives were launched, but were beaten back by the Allies. The stalemate would last from the 12th of November 1951 until 27 July 1953. 8th Army Command Sergeant Major Larry Hampton, then a private, described the life of the soldier during this time.
Well, I was a cannoneer on a Quad 50 machine gun, and a cannoneer and a driver on a M19 twin 40 millimeter weapon. Well, I probably had a very unique experience as a young private. One time I was pulling guard on a bunker What we did in the automatic weapons outfit was we pulled up on the ridge line at night, and we fired harassing and interdiction fire into the Chinese communist lines. And then in daylight, we would pull back off the hill if they had allowed us to, and during the daytime, then we would rest, and then the next night we would go back up. This one particular time, I was down at the bunker pulling guard. It was raining. The flares were going off, and the artillery was going overhead. And I had kind of pushed myself back up under a little alcove in the bunker, and all of a sudden, all of the flares stopped going off, the artillery stopped firing, and it was just totally silent. And I sit there and I wondered what was happening, and then all of a sudden, the flares popped, the artillery started firing again, the machine guns started firing, and I saw coming through the bush, the brush weaving, the grass out in front of the bunker underneath from the light of the flares. And I stood there and I just knew that some Chinese communist was coming out there to cut my throat, and I'm trying to get the rifle off of my shoulder so I could shoot. And I've never had anything take so long in my whole life. And then this little cat came running out of the brush. I immediately done the smart thing. I went in and woke up the next guard and told him it was his time to go on shift. And the next day he raised the dickens with me because I'd woke him up an hour early.